Welcome back. And so in this video, we're going to be talking through a timeline of basically the fall semester for doing your application. So this is kind of walking through what you should probably be doing each month. And before we get too much into it, I will say that this is built around the idea of a fall semester application process starting in August and ending in approximately December. Most graduate programs in psychology, especially PhD programs, typically have application due dates at no earlier than late December, most of them in January, and a few moving into February. Master's programs tend to be a little bit later, with most of the early ones being in January, moving through February, and a few in March. Now, I do want to say that basically you want to make sure that you are selling yourself properly. And what I mean by that is, if a program does not require GREs, if a program doesn't want to look at your GPA, if a program doesn't have a hard due date where all these materials are due, those may seem like programs that are appealing because you don't have to go through this fairly stressful process. Just recognize that not always, but that's usually a good sign that those are also programs where a lot of students do not complete their degree, and those that do complete their degree often find it challenging to find work with that degree. In other words, it's worth putting the effort in to make sure you get into a program whose graduate students do continue on to the careers that they want to do. I've had a fair amount of students over the last 10 to 15 years somewhat not really listen to this advice, and almost to a person, they have come back later and said, I wish I had listened to you. I just wasted a year or two of education, and now I'm back on the process trying to get into a good program. So I can understand the appeal of that program that doesn't require you to spend money and take a GRE test, or that program that basically doesn't have a due date so you can just send in your application, and generally you'll get accepted fairly quickly. Just recognize that's a different model than probably the model that you want, and probably the model that the jobs that you're wanting are looking for. So even if you're applying to a program that doesn't have a due date until January or even February or possibly even early March, I would still suggest sticking to this timeline. And the primary reason to stick to this timeline is that part of this timeline is involving getting your professors to write you letters of recommendation. Those those professors are going to be writing those letters typically in November. So if you actually waited till January or February to contact letter writers because your application isn't due to March, you're probably catching professors who are no longer in kind of the letter writing zone. So I would suggest no matter when the due dates are, I would follow this timeline. And if that means that you actually get done a little earlier than necessary, all the better. You can also always revise your materials if additional information becomes available right before you submit them. So what are you going to be doing in August and September? You're going to be gathering information. You're going to be basically trying to learn as much as you can about the programs that you're interested in, and also try to zero in on what type of program you're applying to. This can include writing to schools, emailing to schools, looking at their web pages, reading their application materials, getting a hold of brochures and catalogs, and this is also where some of those APA manuals that I said are available for sale as resources in the last set of video, or the last video set, might also be useful. Do your research and start to kind of get a feel for where you're wanting to apply. Now, a lot of students also tend to want to apply to their home program. In other words, why leave if you're already comfortable at a university? And a lot of people want to stay kind of in a geographical region. I'm not going to tell you not to do that. If you're very comfortable with where you live, if you're geographically bound, just recognize you are limiting your options. I strongly suggest that you allow the opportunity to consider going to other programs in other states if those programs are really what you need to get to the career that you want. This is your life. You want to do what's right and what's going to get you the best education possible. As you do that research, as you gather that information, what you're kind of looking for are kind of a scale of schools. So how many graduate schools should you apply to? Partly this is a time question, partly this is a monetary question, but generally speaking, you probably want to apply to 4 or 5 schools that you're a good match for. Potentially 1 to 3 sure bets, 1 to 3 borderline schools, and no more than 1 to 3 long shots. So what does that mean? A good match means that looking realistically and honestly at your GRE, your GPA, your experience as an undergrad, and the letters you're going to be getting from your faculty members match what that program that you're applying looks for. So that's a good match. Basically, my GRE and my GPA are solid for this program. I think I'm a good applicant. Borderline programs are programs where maybe you're slightly missing, maybe you're just a little bit low than what they're looking for, but it's still a good program for you. A long shot school basically is the numbers tell you don't to apply, but it's your dream school. An example of this is when I was applying to grad school, I did submit an application to a graduate program at Harvard. I wasn't accepted, but I would have never even known if I could have gotten into Harvard unless I applied. That's a long shot. Sure bets are pretty much schools that you can basically, a good way to think about a sure bet, and this is a little complex, is if it is a school that you'd rather just not go to grad school and you'd rather just take a year off and try to apply again, then that's not a sure bet school. That's a school you shouldn't bother to apply to. A sure bet is a school that you're pretty sure you can get into, and if you got in, you still think you'd be getting a decent education that would get you to your career. It's not a great match, it's not your first choice, but it's making sure that you get into the program that you need to so that you're not losing a year off of your career plans. Once you kind of have this idea in your head of the target schools, you probably also want to reach out again in August and September to your letter writers and just let them know that you're interested in having them write letters of recommendation for you through the graduate school application process. A general note here is when you contact letter writers, I suggest that you start with an email, but the email should ask for an in-person meeting. Now the professor in question may very well know what you're asking for and may simply email, yes, I'd be glad to, we don't need to meet. But if they ask to meet, take that opportunity because you also are determining, are they going to be a good letter writer for you? And when you ask someone to write you a letter for graduate school, I think it's a good idea to specifically ask, can you write me a supportive or a good letter of recommendation? Because if they weren't going to write you a glowing letter, this gives them an opportunity to be blunt and honest with you as well. You want to know, you're not going to ever know exactly what's in those letters, but you want to have a good idea if they're going to be a supportive letter. So you should ask in that way. And finally, you should think about when you're going to register to take the GRE. Generally, you want to take it in October and November, but it's always a good idea to register early and make sure that you've got that taken care of. As we move into October, you need to finalize your target schools. You need to decide which schools are you applying to. You then need to prepare letter writer packs. And that letter writer pack is basically, it can be a folder, it can be a series of papers, but what it needs to be is information for your letter writers. It should include your personal statement. It should include your CV. Both are usually going to be required by graduate programs. It should include an unofficial transcript of your GPA and the classes you've taken. If you've taken the GRE, I would include a copy of your GRE performance. And it should include every school you're applying to, the name of the school, and this is very important, the name of the program you're applying to, how they should submit that letter. Will they be contacted? Do they need to go to a website? Do they need to physically write the letter? Does the letter need to be mailed to the university? Does the letter need to be sealed and given to you? All of those are possible ways that a university may ask for those letters. And you want to give them a timeline of when those letters are due. All of that needs to be in that letter writer pack. You want to give both your letter writer as much information about you as possible, but also enough information about where they're writing the letters so they can write good letters. A lot of times I have people ask me to write letters of recommendation and they tell me the university but not the program. So my letters basically say, I'm recommending this person for graduate study in psychology. That sounds pretty generic, doesn't it? You want to let me know you're specifically applying to the Brain and Cognitive Science program or the Industrial, Organizational, and Social Psychology dual program. What is the specific name of the program? And make sure your letter writers have that. Also, ask your letter writers to give you feedback on your personal statement and your CV. You probably want to start thinking about potentially taking the GRE in October, especially if you're not sure how well you'll do on the GRE. Taking it in October will allow you to retake it. A quick note about retaking the GRE. Generally speaking, most programs are going to take your best performance if you've taken the GRE multiple times. They're not going to hold the fact you took it multiple times against you. In fact, a lot of programs even take that as an indication of how motivated you are. Also, I've been talking about CVs and personal statements. Recognize that some programs may also require individual essays addressing specific questions. You want to make sure that you know about those ahead of time and that you also are working on multiple drafts of that and again getting feedback on those essays before you submit. So let's just briefly talk again about applying to programs. Generally speaking, you probably want to make a list of 20 to 25 total programs that at least are potential possibilities to apply from. And then from that, you probably want to choose 10 to 15 programs. Now again, this may be limited by geography. This may also be limited by your ability to apply to programs. Most of these programs will actually require some small handling fee to apply. And generally speaking, how you want to break those 10 to 15 programs down is about 50% of them you want are programs that you exceed the statistics of recent admissions. That's a good fit. For about 25%, you want to be programs that you meet the statistics that are recent admissions. In other words, that's your sure bets. And then about 25% of programs that you're slightly below the statistics. Those are your long shots. So again, just kind of think about this process. For the most part, you want to be applying to programs that you're probably a pretty good applicant for. You probably want to apply to a few programs where you're a great applicant for. And again, if there's a really good program and you'd love to go there, even if the numbers say you might not be a great shot, go ahead and try because you never know what's going to catch someone's attention. Numbers alone do not determine who gets into graduate programs. So how do you choose these programs? You want to look at program philosophy and curriculum. So one of the things you can be looking for is what are the actual classes I'm going to be taking? Are they really lining up with my career goals? What's the program philosophy? So again, if you know you're wanting a master's degree in industrial organizational psychology and you have no intention of ever pursuing a PhD, you may want to look at programs that are specifically focused on practice and not necessarily on the science and the research. Likewise, if you're interested in going into brain and cognitive science, and though you're looking at master programs, you eventually hope to get a PhD and become a professor, you want to find programs that have a very strong science focus. And again, that gets to that second point, the research versus practice focus. That's going to vary depending on what your career goals are. You also want to look at the faculty. So you might find a program that's a good fit for philosophy, is a fit for your research versus your practice focus, but none of the faculty are interested or teaching or researching anything that interests you. So a similar program that also interests you as far as its research or practice focus and its curriculum that has faculty who has interests that do interest you, that would be a better fitting program. That's the one you might want to apply to. You want to take a look and see if you can gather information on the attrition and the time to finish. This may be a little harder to find, but there is some of that information in that APA Guide to Graduate Programs, because again, if you have a program that has high attrition, that may also tell you something about how likely you are to make it through that program. You generally want to find a program whose selection techniques means that most of the students get in, do complete the program, and complete it in a reasonable set of time. 2 to 3 years for a master's degree, 5 to 6 years at most for a PhD. You want to look at their success at internships, employments, and licensure. So if they're offering practical experiences, how easy is it and how often do their students actually get these experiences? You want to ask questions about financial assistantship. And again, some of this information will be available on the various programs' websites. Some of this information will again be listed in that APA Guide to Graduate Programs. But you want to find out, can I actually get financial aid for going to school? Good graduate programs generally pay most of their students a tuition waiver and a fee in assistantships. You'll be doing a research assistantship or a teaching assistantship. And as a part of that labor, you also not only get an hourly wage, you also get your tuition paid for. Now, you're still going to be responsible for some fees, but the vast majority of your education is going to be paid for by that work. You want to find a program that does that. Generally speaking, that is a good indication of a solid program. You also want to realize that there is differences in cost of living. So different areas do cost more or less. So some programs, you may find two programs that are very identical. You like both of them, but one of them is in downtown New York City. It's going to cost you an enormous amount of money to live anywhere near that program, while the other one's in a small town in Iowa. Now, again, the one in New York may actually have more access to internships and employment and licensure, but it may just cost too much. So take that into account as well. And finally, though I don't think it should be a major concern, be realistic about your own geographical preferences. If you can't imagine living in a small town, or you can't imagine living in a large, huge metropolitan area, don't look at programs that are in those geographical areas. If you can't stand the cold, don't look at a program way up north, unless, of course, it is the very best program for what you want to do. So don't use any single one of these as a make or break on which programs to choose, but you should consider all of them as you're whittling down your programs to a manageable number that you're actually going to apply to. So as we move into November, that's when we're going to get those packets completed and to our faculty for their letter writing. You want to make sure that, again, that you've got that personal statement, that CV, and full information about where those letters are going to go. If you haven't done it already, this is a good time to take the GRE. Now, some students will ask, should I take the psych-specific test, usually only offered in mid-November? My suggestion is that there's kind of three answers to this. First, some programs may require it. If they do, obviously take it. Most programs simply have it as an optional. Generally speaking, if you did well on the GRE, if you've got a good GPA, if you've got good letters and good experience as an undergrad, probably spending the time and money and effort to study for the psych subject test is not necessarily going to be to your advantage unless it's a required test. However, if you've got an applicant that's got a few gray spots on it, maybe your GPA isn't quite what you'd like it to be, maybe you've got a good GPA but your GRE scores aren't where they are, maybe you've got a good GPA and good GRE but you really didn't build up any great relationships with faculty, so you know your letters are going to be a little weak. If you take the psych subject test and do well on it, it will help your application. So just take that into account when you're thinking about whether or not to take it. You want to make sure that you've completed your actual applications with any December deadlines. And again, remember that you also are running into deadlines, not just the deadlines for your letter writers, but your application as well. So applying and making sure that the university you're applying for has everything that you need to apply to that program, including, of course, your materials, but also your transcripts, your GRE, and your letters. This is a good time to be requesting those transcripts and make sure that they're being sent to the right places, and also making sure your GRE scores are being sent to the right places. And finally, you may need to update your classes taken to include intended classes. In other words, if the program itself has certain required undergraduate classes you haven't taken yet, make sure that your materials do include that you will be taking those and when. So they may be, for example, being taken in the spring or summer semester prior to when you'd be admitted to that graduate program, but let them know that you're on top of it, you know the requirements, and you're getting it done. That takes us into December, the end of the semester. Again, just a reminder, if you haven't done it yet or need to retake it, again, we can look at the GRE at this point. And at this point, it's probably a good idea to confirm that the letters are sent. And generally how you can do this is not by pestering your professors or your letter writers. What you probably want to do is actually reach out to the programs and simply send a very polite email asking, I just want to make sure all my materials are available. Now, some of this is now managed online where you can actually sign into your account, your application, and find out if they've actually been received. If a program says we're actually missing a letter of one of your letters, you can always ask, can I ask which letters you've received? And that way you know who to actually basically give a gentle nudge to. If you find out one of your letter writers has not sent a letter on time, I would not be aggressive, I would not be mean, I would simply reach out to them and ask, hey, just making sure you sent the letter. If not, please make sure to send it to this following address. Just to remind them what needs to be done. You want to complete any remaining applications at this point, and I would honestly say, again, even if your applications aren't due until January or February, it's unlikely that new information is going to become available over the break between fall and spring semester. And in that case, I would suggest just completing your applications by the end of December, just to have it off your list. You're done. A final thing is that if you have any forms that you had to fill out, anything that you had to submit electronically, it's not a bad idea to either keep e-copies, PDFs, or photocopies. Just in case those forms do get lost, you have copies that you can provide. And finally, once all your letter writers have completed their task and your letters are sent, it's not a bad idea to say thank you somewhat officially. I would suggest a small thank you note that you leave in the faculty member's mailbox within their departments.